At my retirement party, just as I reached for a gift box my children had sent with a note that read, "Dad, we're sorry." My attorney stepped in front of me and said quietly, "Don't touch it. Something about this box isn't right." I looked at him, then at my friends, smiling around the room. "They're my children," I said. "They wouldn't do this." He slipped on a pair of gloves and lifted the lid himself. The color drained from my face before either of us touched what was hidden inside. Within the hour, police officers were standing in that room. "I am so grateful you are here with me today. Before we go further, drop a comment and tell me where are you watching from, your city, your state, your country. I genuinely want to know who is in this room with me." A quick note. Some details in this story have been shaped for storytelling and educational purposes. Any similarity to actual names or places is entirely coincidental, but everything this story means, I mean completely. The last light of October was bleeding out across the Illinois sky when I finally locked up the office. I stood at the window of Callaway Building Supply for what felt like a long time, looking down at the yard below. 30 trucks, 25 employees, a warehouse that Eleanor and I had built from nothing but stubbornness and a belief that hard work eventually pays off. 40 years of early mornings and late nights of cold winters and tight budgets and moments when I genuinely did not know if we were going to make payroll that Friday. And tomorrow night, it was all supposed to become a memory. My retirement party was set for 6 o'clock at Drury Lane in Oak Brook. Robert had been planning it for weeks, sending me text messages with menu options I never responded to and seating arrangements I never looked at. I told him anything was fine. He told me I was the worst guest of honor he had ever dealt with. That made me laugh for the first time in days. I pulled open the top drawer of my desk before I left. I do not know why. Maybe habit? Maybe something else I could not name. And there it was, a copy of the check I had written to Michael 3 years ago. $120,000. My signature in blue ink slightly rushed the way it always was when I signed large amounts, like my hand wanted to get it over with before my brain could object. I had written that check on a Tuesday afternoon. Michael had sat across from me at this same desk and told me he had finally found the right house, the right neighborhood, the right school district for when he eventually had kids. His eyes were bright with something I wanted to believe was gratitude. I wanted so badly to believe it. I put the check back in the drawer and closed it. Brendan Walsh knocked on the open office door just as I was reaching for my coat. He was my operations manager and had been with me for 12 years, a quiet, methodical man who ran the yard with the kind of calm authority that made everyone around him feel like things were under control even when they were not. "Big day tomorrow," he said from the doorway. "Trying not to think about it," I told him. He nodded and looked like he wanted to say something else. His mouth opened slightly, then closed again. He shifted his weight from one foot to the other, and I noticed his jaw was tight in a way it usually was not. "Everything okay, Brendan?" "Yeah," he said a little too quickly. "Yeah, of course. Get some rest, Arthur. See you at the party." He left before I could ask again. I drove home along the Naperville Riverwalk the long way, the way Eleanor and I used to drive on Sunday evenings when neither of us wanted the weekend to end. The trees along the river had gone fully red and gold leaves letting go in slow drifts across the windshield. Eleanor had loved this time of year more than any other. She used to roll down the window even when it was cold just to smell the air. She had been gone for 2 years now. 2 years, and I still reached for her side of the bed on Sunday mornings. The house was lit up when I pulled into the driveway. Every downstairs light was on, which meant someone had let themselves in with a key. 3 cars I recognized were parked along the curb: Michael's black SUV, Sarah's silver sedan, and David's leased coupe that I had quietly helped him with the deposit on 8 months ago. My chest tightened in a way that had nothing to do with my heart condition. I walked through the front door and found all 3 of them arranged in the living room, with a precision that did not look accidental. Michael sat forward on the couch, elbows on his knees, hands clasped. Sarah occupied the armchair nearest the fireplace. Eleanor's chair with her handbag held against her side like she was protecting something inside it. David sat at the far end of the couch, and the moment I stepped into the room, he looked down at his hands. "Dad." Michael stood up first, his smile wide and warm, and landing nowhere near his eyes. "We didn't want to bother you at the office. We thought we'd catch you here." "You could have called," I said. "We wanted to do this in person." Sarah uncrossed her legs and leaned forward slightly. Her voice carried that careful, measured quality she had developed sometime in her 20s, the kind of tone that sounded reasonable no matter what was being said underneath it. "Dad, we've been talking about the business, about the transition. And we think there's a smarter way to handle the retirement than what you and Robert have planned." I set my keys on the entry table and walked into the room without hurrying. I sat down in the chair across from Michael and looked at all three of them the way I used to look at a contract, before signing slowly, looking for the clause that would cost me later. "What kind of smarter way?" I asked. Michael leaned further forward, his voice dropping into the register he used when he wanted to sound like he was sharing a confidence. "If you transfer ownership of the company before you officially retire, rather than after you avoid a significant estate tax liability down the road. We've had someone look at the numbers. The savings could be substantial." "Who looked at the numbers?" "A financial advisor," Sarah said smoothly. "Someone with experience in family business transitions." "Robert Vance has been my attorney for 40 years, I said. "He's already handled the transition structure." Michael's smile stayed in place, but something behind it shifted, a small tightening around the eyes. A micro-adjustment that lasted less than a second before he smoothed it back out. "Robert's great, Dad. We're not saying he isn't. We're just saying there might be options he hasn't considered." David had not said a word. He was still looking at his hands, and his right thumb was pressing into his left palm in slow rhythmic circles, the way he used to do as a child when he was uncomfortable and trying not to show it. I looked at my youngest son for a long moment. He did not look up. "I'll think about it," I said, which was not a yes and was not meant to be. They stayed for another 40 minutes, talking around the subject in widening circles, each loop bringing them a little closer to numbers and timelines and language I recognized as legal framework, without being able to identify the specific document it came from. Sarah did most of the talking. Michael reinforced at intervals. David contributed 3 sentences total, none of them substantive. When they finally left, I stood at the window and watched their taillights disappear around the corner. Then I went to the kitchen, poured a glass of water I did not drink, and stood at the counter looking at the photograph on the refrigerator. Eleanor and me on the day we poured the foundation for the second warehouse, both of us covered in dust, both of us grinning like idiots. "Something's wrong, Elle," I said to the photograph. "I just can't name it yet." My phone buzzed on the counter. A message from Brendan Walsh. "Arthur, I need to show you something tomorrow morning. Come early. Don't mention it to anyone." The fog had not lifted yet when I pulled into the Callaway Building Supply parking lot at 6:45 in the morning. The yard was empty at that hour, trucks still lined up in their overnight rows, the loading dock quiet, the whole place carrying that particular stillness that exists in a workplace before the workday begins. I had loved this time of morning for 40 years. Eleanor used to say I was the only person she knew who was genuinely happy to arrive somewhere before anyone else. Brendan's truck was already there, backed into his usual spot near the side entrance. The light in my office upstairs was on. I found him sitting at the small table in the corner of the room rather than at his desk, which told me immediately that whatever this was, it was not a work conversation. A manila envelope sat on the table in front of him, thick enough that the metal clasp was straining slightly. His hands were flat on either side of it, palms down like he was steadying himself. "Close the door," he said when I walked in. I closed it. "Brendan, you look like you haven't slept." "I haven't." He looked up and his eyes were red at the edges, the skin beneath them dark and heavy. Arthur, before I show you what's in here, I need you to understand something. I didn't bring this to you sooner because I wanted to be sure. I needed to be absolutely sure before I said a word, because once I say it, it can't be unsaid. My throat tightened. I sat down across from him and kept my voice level. Then say it. Brendan pushed the envelope across the table. I opened the clasp and pulled out the contents slowly. The first thing I saw was a photograph, a printout slightly grainy, taken from what appeared to be the security camera in our main filing room. In the image, a man I recognized immediately was standing at the open cabinet where we kept the master contracts for our largest accounts. He was photographing documents with his phone methodically, one page at a time. My son Michael. The timestamp in the corner of the image read a Tuesday afternoon 3 months earlier. A day I had been out of the office at a site inspection in Joliet. There are 6 more photos like that one, Brendan said, his voice tight and careful. Different days always when you were out. He told the front desk he was dropping something off for you. They let him through because he's your son. I set the photograph down and moved to the next item. A printed log of incoming calls to our accounting department, specific dates, specific times, a number I did not recognize at first. Brendan had circled it in red pen. That's Sarah's cell, he said quietly. She called Linda in accounting 4 times over 6 weeks, asking about the replacement value of our equipment fleet and the current balance on the business life insurance policy on you. The air in the room felt different than it had 30 seconds ago. I kept going through the envelope. There were printed emails, next exchanges between our system and an outside address that Brendan had traced to a commercial real estate consulting firm in Chicago. The emails were exploratory inquiries about the acquisition value of a mid-sized building supply operation in the western suburbs, sent under David's name, addressed to a competitor I recognized from years of running parallel bids. David had been shopping my company to my competitors. Before I had even officially retired, my hands were steady on the documents, but somewhere behind my sternum something was twisting slowly and painfully, like a muscle being wrung out. These were my children. I had coached Michael's Little League team. I had driven Sarah to college orientation with the car packed so full we could barely see out the back window. I had held David in the hospital the night he was born and felt the specific terror and joy of being responsible for another human life. There's one more thing, Brendan said. He reached into the envelope himself and removed a smaller sleeve, a clear plastic folder containing photocopies of documents I recognized immediately. Checks. Every check I had ever written to my 3 children over the past 5 years, copied from our business accounting records. Alongside each check was a printed email exchange confirming the purpose of the loan, Michael's home purchase, Sarah's credit card debt, David's investment capital, each one with a reply from the recipient, acknowledging the amount and the terms. I've been keeping copies of everything for 8 months, Brendan said. Every transaction that looked like it might matter someday. His voice cracked slightly on the last word, and he pressed his lips together hard, fighting it back. Arthur, I want you to know, this company is the best place I have ever worked. You and Eleanor built something that actually means something, and I was not going to sit here and watch someone take it apart from the inside without at least making sure you knew. I looked at my operations manager across the table. This man who showed up every day without drama, who solved problems before I knew they existed, who had never once asked for more than he was owed. Brendan. My voice came out rougher than I intended. You did the right thing. You did exactly the right thing. He exhaled a long, slow release of something he had clearly been holding for months. His shoulders dropped 2 inches. What are you going to do? He asked. I was already reaching for my phone. I'm going to call Robert Vance and clear his schedule for the rest of the week. I stood up the envelope in my hand. And then I'm going to go to my retirement party tomorrow night and act like everything is completely fine. Brendan stared at me. How are you going to do that? I looked at him for a moment, at the worry carved into his face, at the exhaustion of a man who had been carrying someone else's problem for 8 months, because he thought it was the right thing to do. Because Eleanor taught me a long time ago, I said, that the most dangerous thing you can do to someone who is trying to blindside you is to let them keep thinking they're going to succeed. I called Robert from the parking lot standing next to my car, while the fog finally began to burn off the Naperville River walk in the distance. He picked up on the second ring. Robert, clear your schedule. All of it. Pull everything you know about family trusts, promissory notes, and guardianship law in Illinois. I paused. And one more thing. I need to make an appointment with a cardiologist for a routine checkup this week. Can you recommend someone at Del Nor? There was a brief silence on Robert's end. When he spoke again, his voice had shifted into the register I had heard only a handful of times in 40 years of friendship. The one that meant he understood that something serious was happening, and he was already thinking 3 steps ahead. I'll have everything ready by tonight, he said. Arthur, are you all right? I looked back at the building. At the Callaway Building supply sign above the entrance, the letters Eleanor had chosen herself from a catalog in 1987, because she liked the way they looked solid and permanent. Not yet, I said, but I'm going to be. 1 week later, I was lying in a hospital bed at Northwestern Medicine Delner Hospital in Geneva, Illinois, staring at a ceiling that had nothing interesting on it whatsoever. The chest pains had turned out to be what Dr. Patrick Ellison, a trim, precise man in his early 50s, who spoke in complete sentences and never used 2 words when one would do, described as a mild cardiac episode brought on by stress and insufficient sleep. Nothing structural, nothing requiring intervention. Rest, reduced caffeine, and a follow-up in 30 days. You're not dying, Mr. Callaway, he told me on the first morning in a tone that suggested he had delivered this particular reassurance many times before. You're just not taking care of yourself the way a man your age should be. I'll add it to the list, I said. He did not find that funny. My children arrived that first afternoon with flowers and good intentions, wearing thin disguises. Michael brought coffee from the good place downtown, not the hospital cafeteria. Sarah carried a tote bag that clinked with the sound of things she had brought to make the room more comfortable. David held a paperback novel he had clearly grabbed from an airport rack, without reading the back cover because the genre was something neither of us had ever had any interest in. They stayed for 2 hours. They asked about my diet, my sleep, my stress levels. They asked gentle questions about the retirement transition, about the party planning, about whether I had given any more thought to the conversation they had started at the house the week before. I told them I was focusing on resting. That night I could not sleep. The hospital had that particular nighttime quality that anyone who has spent time in one will recognize the soft percussion of the building working around you. The distant murmur of a nurse's station. The way the light under the door changes when someone walks past in the corridor. I had been awake for 2 hours watching the pale line of hallway light shift and settle when I heard voices outside my room. Sarah's voice first. Low and controlled the way she always spoke when she was managing a situation. I pushed back the blanket and moved to the door in my socked feet, placing each step carefully on the linoleum floor. The door was not fully latched. There was a gap of perhaps 2 inches where the latch had not caught properly. I stood to the side of it and listened. You both need to have this memorized before we speak to Dr. Weston, Sarah was saying. There was the sound of paper, something being held referenced. It needs to be consistent across all 3 of us. The moment we contradict each other, it falls apart. My heart was beating very hard against my ribs. Dad has been showing signs of confusion, she continued, her voice carrying the flat, rehearsed quality of someone reading from a prepared text. Difficulty with memory. Disorientation while driving. On at least 2 occasions, he spoke about Mom as though she were still alive, not as a memory, but as a present reality. I pressed my back against the wall beside the door. My legs felt unsteady beneath me, and I put one hand flat on the wall surface to keep myself grounded. And the business decisions. Michael's voice came next, lower than Sarah's, rougher at the edges. Erratic financial decisions. Large sums given away without clear purpose. That's good, Sarah said. Use that phrase exactly, erratic financial decisions. It's the kind of language that carries weight in a competency evaluation. I should explain what a competency evaluation means in this context because it matters enormously. In Illinois, if a court is persuaded that a person can no longer manage their own affairs due to cognitive decline, it can issue a ruling declaring that person legally incompetent. Once that ruling is in place, a guardian is appointed, typically a family member, who gains full legal authority over that person's finances, property, and major decisions. The person themselves loses the right to enter contracts, change their will, or make independent financial choices. Everything they own effectively transfers to the guardian's control. My children were preparing a script to convince a psychiatrist that their father was losing his mind. Sarah. David's voice came from further away, quieter than the other two, with a hesitation in it that made something in my chest respond before my brain caught up. Is this actually necessary? Can't we just sit down with him and... He's already been talking to Robert Vance. Sarah cut in, her voice dropping the rehearsed quality and becoming something sharper and more direct. He's already setting up a structure we won't be able to challenge once it's in place. It's too late for a conversation, David. We needed to have that conversation 2 years ago. A pause, the sound of paper being folded. Dr. Francis Weston does independent cognitive assessments, Sarah continued. I've already called her office. We request the evaluation as concerned family members. We present consistent testimony. The rest follows its own logic. My hand was pressed so hard against the wall that I could feel the texture of the paint through my palm. I was not shaking. I was past shaking into that territory of extreme stillness that comes when something is so wrong that the body does not know how to process it into movement. These were my children. Michael, who had learned to ride a bicycle in the driveway of our first house on a Saturday morning in June, with Eleanor running alongside him and me watching from the porch steps with a camera. Sarah, who had called me from her college dormitory during her first week away because she missed home and would not admit it, so she talked about her classes for an hour instead. David, born in the middle of a February snowstorm, the smallest and the last, who had fallen asleep on my chest in the hospital and stayed there for 3 hours while Eleanor slept, and the snow kept falling outside. I walked back to the bed. I lay down. I pulled the blanket up. The ceiling of the hospital room was white and smooth and entirely without expression. And I stared at it until the light under the door stopped changing and the corridor outside went quiet. They thought I was an old man who could be frightened into compliance. They thought grief and age and a mild cardiac episode had made me soft enough to manage. They had forgotten what I did for 40 years. A man who builds a business from nothing does not do it by giving up when the situation becomes difficult. He does it by staying very still and very quiet and very focused until he understands exactly what he is dealing with. By the time the sky outside my window began to lighten from black to gray, I had made 3 decisions. I was not going to tell them what I had heard. I was not going to change my behavior in any way that might signal awareness. And in the morning when Dr. Ellison came for his rounds, I was going to ask him for a referral to a psychiatrist at my own request on my own terms before my children could move first. The most dangerous thing you can do to someone who is trying to blindside you is to let them keep thinking they are going to succeed. Eleanor had taught me that. Morning in a hospital has its own particular rhythm. The breakfast trays arrive before the light outside has fully committed to being daylight. The nursing shift changes with a burst of quiet efficiency in the corridor. Doctors begin their rounds with the focused energy of people who have been awake longer than they appear. By the time Dr. Patrick Ellison pushed open my door at 7:45 with my chart in his hand and a cup of coffee he had clearly not yet finished, I had been awake for 2 hours, and I knew exactly what I was going to say. "How did you sleep?" he asked, settling into the chair beside the bed, with the practiced ease of someone who had conducted 10,000 of these conversations. "Well enough," I said. "Dr. Ellison, before you start, I want to request something." He looked up from the chart. "Go ahead. I want an independent cognitive evaluation, a full one, scheduled at my request on my terms with a psychiatrist of your choosing, not anyone my family has contacted or suggested. I want it documented that this evaluation was initiated by me, not by my next of kin." Dr. Ellison studied me for a moment, with the particular expression of a physician recalibrating. He was quiet for the span of perhaps 4 seconds, not long, but long enough to be meaningful. "May I ask what prompted this?" he said carefully. "Let's just say I have reasons to want my mental competency on record before certain other people have the opportunity to raise questions about it." He held my gaze. Then he wrote something in the chart, closed it, and said, "I'll refer you to Dr. Frances Weston. She's the best independent evaluator in this region, and she has no existing relationship with your family. The evaluation will be fully documented as patient-initiated." He paused. "Mr. Calloway, is there anything else I should know?" "Not yet," I said, "but thank you." He left. I sat up straighter in the bed and waited. They arrived at 9:15, all three of them filing through the door with the coordinated timing of people who had agreed on an entrance. Michael carried coffee again, a different brand this time from a place closer to the hospital. Sarah had the tote bag from the day before. David was wearing the same jacket he had worn yesterday, which told me he had not gone home the previous night, and had instead stayed somewhere close by. The performance began within minutes. Sarah positioned herself nearest to the door, nearest to the corridor, I noted nearest to where a doctor might appear, and within 10 minutes of their arrival, she had smoothly redirected the conversation toward my health in a way that felt organic but was not. "Dad, I have to be honest. We've all noticed some things over the past few months that have worried us." Her voice was soft, with a concern so precisely calibrated it made my back teeth ache. "Little things. The kind of things you might not notice yourself." Michael leaned forward in his chair, his elbows on his knees, his expression arranged into something that was trying very hard to resemble loving anxiety. "Remember last month when you drove to the old warehouse address instead of the new one? You told me it just slipped your mind, but Dad, that's a route you've driven 1,000 times. I had driven to the old address once because I was on the phone with the supplier and not paying attention. It had taken me 30 seconds to realize the mistake and correct it. I had mentioned it to Michael in passing as a minor irritation. He had stored it like ammunition. And there was the thing with Mom," David said quietly, and his voice when he said it had something different in it than the other two, something rougher and less rehearsed, something that sounded almost like genuine discomfort. "You talked about her in the present tense at dinner at Michael's place, like she was going to be joining us." I looked at my youngest son. His hands were pressed together between his knees, and the muscle along his jaw was working in a tight, rhythmic way that I recognized from his childhood as the physical manifestation of something he did not want to be doing. "David," I said, keeping my voice completely even, "I talk about your mother in the present tense because 40 years of marriage means she is present to me. That is grief, not confusion. There is a difference." David opened his mouth, closed it. His jaw worked harder. The door opened, and Dr. Ellison stepped back in for a secondary check routine. He said just a brief follow-up. Sarah turned toward him with the smooth efficiency of someone who had been waiting for exactly this moment, her expression shifting into the concerned daughter register she had clearly been rehearsing. "Dr. Ellison, we've been so relieved to have him here where he can be monitored. We've been concerned for a while now, haven't we?" That last part was directed at Michael and David, not phrased as a question. Absolutely, Michael said immediately. Dr. Ellison listened. He nodded at appropriate intervals. He wrote something that I could not see. And then he looked across the room at me with an expression that was professionally neutral and entirely unreadable, and said, Mr. Calloway, I've already arranged the referral we discussed this morning. Dr. Weston's office will be in touch directly with you personally, to schedule at your convenience. The temperature in the room changed. It was not dramatic. There was no single visible reaction I could point to. But the quality of the air shifted in the way it does when three people in a room simultaneously process information they were not expecting and have not yet decided how to respond to. Sarah's next breath was a fraction of a second longer than the one before it. Michael's coffee cup stopped halfway to his mouth and then continued. David looked at his hands. I was discharged that afternoon. I declined the offer of a ride from all three of my children. I called a car service from the lobby, stood outside the hospital entrance in the October air with my overnight bag at my feet, and watched a red maple drop 3 leaves in succession onto the sidewalk while I waited. My phone buzzed. Robert Vance. Arthur. I've spent the past week pulling everything on Illinois guardianship law, family trust structures, and promissory note enforcement. I think I know what they're planning. A pause, and then the careful tone of a man choosing his words with 40 years of legal precision. And I think I know how to make sure it never works. Come to my office tonight. Bring Brendan's envelope. The car pulled up to the curb. I picked up my bag. I'll be there at 7, I said. I went home first. Not because I needed to. The hospital had discharged me with nothing more than a pamphlet about cardiac health and a prescription for a medication I had already been taking, but because I needed 1 hour inside my own house before I walked into Robert's office. I needed to stand in my kitchen and drink a glass of water and look at Eleanor's photograph on the refrigerator and remind myself who I was before the conversation I was about to have. The house was quiet in the way it had been quiet for 2 years. Not empty exactly. Eleanor had left too much of herself in the arrangement of the furniture and the choice of the curtains and the garden she had planted along the back fence for the place to ever feel truly empty. But quiet in the way that a room feels when the person who filled it most completely is no longer there. I changed my clothes, drank the water, looked at the photograph for a long moment, and left. Robert Vance's office was on the 2nd floor of a brick building on Chicago Avenue in downtown Naperville, 3 blocks from the river. He had been in the same office for 22 years, and it looked exactly like a room that had been occupied by the same serious and meticulous man for 22 years. Floor-to-ceiling bookshelves, a desk the size of a dining table, and a lamp that cast a warm yellow light that made everything look slightly more manageable than it probably was. Robert himself was 65 years old, built like a man who had played rugby in college and never entirely stopped with gray hair. He kept short and sharp. Blue eyes that had a disconcerting habit of staying completely still when he was thinking hard. We had known each other for 40 years, since we were both young men renting opposite ends of a drafty apartment building in Wicker Park and arguing about baseball on the shared porch. He was standing at his desk when I walked in, 2 mugs of coffee, already poured, Brendan's envelope open in front of him. I took the liberty, he said, nodding at the envelope. You said to pull everything, and you told me what was in it, so I started without you. Sit down. I sat. He remained standing. Robert always thought better on his feet. First, he said, tell me about the hallway conversation at the hospital. I told him. All of it word for word as I remembered it, which was perfectly because I had spent the night fixing each phrase in my memory with the deliberate precision of a man who understood he would need to repeat it accurately later. Robert listened without interrupting. His eyes still, his coffee untouched. When I finished, he let out a long breath through his nose. Frances Weston, he said. Smart. She's thorough and genuinely independent. The fact that you got to Ellison first and requested her yourself before they could. He picked up his coffee and pointed it briefly in my direction. That was the right move. Now tell me what you know, I said. A lawyer named Garrett Pullman filed a preliminary inquiry last Thursday with the DuPage County Circuit Court regarding guardianship proceedings for a 60-year-old male subject in Naperville. He did not name you directly in the filing that comes later, but the description is specific enough. Robert set down the mug. Pullman specializes in contested guardianship cases. He does not do family estate work. Someone hired him for a specific purpose. My hands were resting on the arms of the chair, and I pressed my fingers into the upholstery with enough force to feel the frame beneath. How did you find this out? Because when a lawyer files a preliminary inquiry involving a potential conflict of interest with an existing client, other lawyers in the relevant practice area get notified through standard conflict check procedures. I, attorney of record, Pullman's filing triggered a notification to my office 3 days ago. Robert looked at me steadily. Arthur, they have been planning this for longer than you think. The room felt smaller than it had when I walked in. What do we do? I asked. Robert pulled a yellow legal pad from the corner of his desk and turned it to face me. On it, in his precise block handwriting, was a structure I had never seen before. Boxes connected by lines, dollar amounts, legal terms, arrows indicating direction of authority. We build something they cannot touch, he said. I'm calling it the Callaway Family Trust. But it is not a trust in the traditional sense. It is a legal mechanism that converts every dollar you have ever given your children into documented enforceable debt. He picked up a pen and tapped the first box. The $120,000 you gave Michael for his house. The $85,000 for Sarah's credit card debt. The $45,000 for David's investment capital. All of it. They were gifts, I said. No, Robert said firmly, leaning forward with both hands on the desk. They were not gifts. They were loans. And we have the evidence to prove it, every check, every email, in which each of them acknowledged the amount and its purpose. Brendan kept everything. He straightened up. What we are going to do is have you formally execute promissory notes for each of those amounts, legally binding documents, in which each of your children acknowledges the debt and pledges specific assets as collateral. I need to explain what this means in practical terms because the mechanics of it matter. A promissory note is a legal document in which a borrower formally acknowledges a debt and commits to repaying it. When that note includes a collateral pledge, meaning the borrower puts up a specific asset like a house or a vehicle, as security, the lender gains the legal right to seize that asset if the debt goes unpaid. Robert was proposing to transform what my children had received as family money into formal court-enforceable loans secured against everything they owned. Michael's house, Sarah's investment accounts, David's car and whatever assets he had accumulated. If they file the guardianship petition, Robert continued, his voice carrying the calm certainty of a man who had spent 40 years building legal structures that held under pressure. The trust immediately calls in all 3 debts. They will be fighting a guardianship case while simultaneously facing foreclosure on their homes and seizure of their accounts. No competent attorney will continue representing them under those conditions. I looked at the yellow legal pad for a long time. Is this legal? I asked. Every word of it, Robert said. Illinois Trust Code 760 ILCS 3. The promissory notes are fully supported by existing documentation. The collateral pledges require signatures from your children, which they will provide because the documents will be presented as routine loan acknowledgement paperwork, a standard legal formality confirming amounts they have already received. They will see nothing alarming on the surface. They will not understand the full implication of what they are signing until it is too late. He paused. Arthur Thier have been a corporate attorney for 40 years. The only weapon I have ever used is the law itself applied with more precision than the other side expects. I picked up a pen from his desk. Tell me where to sign, I said. Robert held up one hand. Not yet. There are two more pieces. I need Brendan Walsh on a conference call to confirm the documentation chain, and I need Cynthia Draper at First Midwest Bank to confirm the procedural mechanics for the trust account structure. He looked at his watch. And there is one more thing I want to arrange for your retirement party. Something that will ensure we are protected regardless of what they attempt on the night. He did not elaborate. He simply looked at me with the expression of a man who had already thought of everything and was enjoying the fact that for the moment no one else had. Trust me on this one. Brendan Walsh answered on the second ring. We put him on speaker, and for the next 40 minutes, the three of us, a retired building supply company owner, a corporate attorney, and an operations manager who had spent 8 months quietly saving every piece of paper that might matter, built the legal structure that my children would eventually spend the rest of their lives wishing they had never forced into existence. At 10:30, I walked back to my car through the cool October air. The streets of downtown Naperville were quiet, the river invisible in the darkness beyond the bridge. I stood beside the car for a moment, before getting in my hand on the door handle, looking up at the strip of sky between the buildings. We're building something they cannot touch, Elle, I said quietly. Just like we always did. 6 weeks is a long time to keep a secret, and a short time to build a legal fortress. I had done both. The morning of my retirement party arrived the way significant mornings often do, quietly, without announcement, with the same gray pre-dawn light that preceded every other morning I could remember. I was awake before 5, which was not unusual. I made coffee in the kitchen, stood at the back window, and looked out at the garden Eleanor had planted along the fence line the summer before she got sick. The black-eyed Susans had gone dormant for the season. The ornamental grasses were bent and silver in the October cold. A knock at the front door at 7:30 pulled me away from the window. Dorothy Finch was my neighbor to the left, a woman of 68, who had lived in the house next door for longer than I had lived in mine, who had brought meals over every week for the first 4 months after Eleanor died, without ever once making me feel like a charity case, and who possessed the rare quality of knowing exactly when another person needed company and when they needed to be left alone. She was standing on my porch with a bunch of sunflowers wrapped in brown paper and a smile that reached all the way up. "Eleanor would have been so proud of you today, Arthur," she said simply. My throat tightened in a way I had not anticipated. I took the sunflowers and managed a thank you that came out rougher than I intended. And Dorothy Finch, being Dorothy Finch, pretended not to notice and asked instead whether I had eaten breakfast. I had not. She came in and made eggs while I got dressed, and we ate together at the kitchen table the way Eleanor and I used to eat on weekend mornings. And for 20 minutes, the house felt inhabited in a way it had not felt in a long time. By 4 o'clock, I was standing in front of my bedroom mirror in the navy suit. Eleanor had bought it for me on our 20th company anniversary, from a tailor in the city whose name I could no longer remember. She had held it up in the store and said with complete conviction that I would wear it when I retired. She wanted to see me in it one last time. She had not made it to today, but the suit had, and I put it on carefully, as if the act itself was something I owed her. The jacket still fit. That surprised me more than it probably should have. Drury Lane in Oak Brook was a venue Eleanor and I had attended for events over the years. A large, well-appointed event space with high ceilings and good acoustics, and a staff that moved through a crowded room without being noticed. Robert had chosen it, and I had told him whatever he thought was best, which was how I ended up walking into a room of 60 people at 6 o'clock, who all stopped talking at once and started clapping. Raymond Coaster found me within 30 seconds of my arrival. Raymond was 63, a former client, who had become a genuine friend over 2 decades of doing business together, a broad-shouldered man from a German-American family in Wheaton, who laughed loudly and meant it every time. He pressed a glass of something into my hand and said loudly enough for the people nearest us to hear, 40 years, Arthur, you stubborn old man. I didn't think you'd actually do it. Neither did I said, and meant it more than he knew. Robert appeared at my elbow 20 minutes into the evening, while Raymond was holding court with a group of people I recognized from the industry. Robert steered me gently toward a quieter corner near the window, with the practiced ease of a man who had been managing conversations for 4 decades. The trust documents are fully executed, he said, his voice low and even. Cynthia Draper confirmed the account structure this afternoon. Everything is in place. Good, I said. There's one more thing. He nodded toward the far corner of the room, where a young man in dark clothing was setting up what appeared to be professional camera equipment on a sturdy tripod. His name is Danny Kowalski. He's a professional event videographer I've worked with before. He will be recording continuously from 6 o'clock until the end of the evening. I looked at Robert. It's a retirement party, not a film production. Consider it my gift to you, Robert said, and the expression on his face was the one I had learned over 40 years, meant that he had already thought of everything and was not going to explain it until the explanation became necessary. Enjoy the party, Arthur. Everything is under control. I wanted to press him further, but Raymond was already heading back in our direction, with 2 more people in tow, and the expression of someone who intended to tell an embarrassing story about me from 2003, and the moment passed. For 2 hours I shook hands and heard stories I had told myself, and some I had not, and ate food I did not taste, and smiled until my face ached with it. Somewhere in that room, 60 people who had known me across different chapters of my life were celebrating an ending that felt from the inside much more like a beginning. Then the server appeared at my shoulder. She was young, perhaps 25, with the careful demeanor of someone trained to be unobtrusive. She leaned in slightly and spoke in the low register of someone delivering information she had been instructed to pass on quietly. Mr. Calloway there is a gentleman at the front entrance. He says he has a personal delivery for you. He has been waiting for approximately 10 minutes. I set down my glass. Robert was already moving toward me from across the room, his expression telling me nothing and everything simultaneously. The server was a young woman named Kara, barely 20 years old, with a polite smile that did not quite reach her eyes. "Sir," she said, lowering her voice just enough so the guests nearby could not hear, "there is a gentleman at the side entrance. He says he has a personal delivery. He has been waiting since 5:30. I glanced at Robert. His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, the way it did whenever something crossed his desk that he had not anticipated. 5:30, I said. The party doesn't start until 7. Yes, sir. He said it was important that he deliver it directly to you. Robert placed a firm hand on my shoulder before I could take a step. Let me go first, he said quietly, his tone carrying that particular weight that told me this was not a suggestion. Raymond Coaster, who had been laughing with a group of former colleagues near the bar, noticed the exchange and drifted toward us with a practiced casualness. Raymond was 63, a German-American contractor who had supplied roofing materials to Callaway Building Supply. For over 2 decades, a man who read rooms as instinctively as he read blueprints. He said nothing, but he fell into step half a pace behind Robert. Danny Kowalski was already moving. I caught the slight shift of his shoulder as he repositioned the camera toward the side corridor, the lens sweeping the space in one fluid arc that looked to any casual observer like nothing more than a videographer capturing the evening's atmosphere. The man at the side entrance was not at all what I expected. He was older than me. I thought perhaps 70 or 71, with silver hair combed back neatly above a face mapped with deep lines. He wore a gray jacket that had seen better decades and held a rectangular cardboard box approximately 18 inches long and 12 inches wide. A printed shipping label was fixed to the top. He clutched the box with both arms pressed against his ribs as if he were cold, though the October evening was mild. Mr. Calloway, he said, his voice thin and careful. That's me, I said. He exhaled slowly, and I noticed his hands were trembling, not with age, but with something that looked very much like relief at finally being able to set the box down. "My name is Gerald Whitmore," he said. "I was asked to deliver this. Tonight. Specifically, tonight." Robert stepped forward. "Asked by whom, Mr. Whitmore?" Gerald's eyes moved between Robert and me, and in that brief hesitation I saw something I had not expected: shame. Not the discomfort of a man doing an odd job. Something heavier than that. "I was told it was a retirement gift," Gerald said, "from the family." The phrase landed in the air between us like something dropped from a height. Robert looked at me. I looked at the box. The shipping label read, "Callaway Building Supply Personal Handle with Care." 15 pounds. Robert lifted it with one hand, his brow furrowed. "This isn't 15 pounds. He said, his voice even and precise, the voice of a man who had spent 40 years measuring discrepancies. "This is closer to 4, maybe 5 at most." He set it back on the side table and turned to Danny with a single nod. Danny stepped forward, camera running, and filmed the label, the seal, and the dimensions of the box from 3 separate angles without being asked. "Mr. Whitmore," Robert said, turning back to Gerald, "before Mr. Callaway opens anything, I need to ask you a few questions. Is that all right with you?" Gerald nodded quickly, almost gratefully. His shoulders dropped as if a weight he had been carrying for days had just been lifted from them. I stood watching the old man's face and felt something cold and slow settle into my chest. Not fear, not quite, but the particular dread of a man who has just realized that what he thought was a farewell celebration is something else entirely. Behind me, the warm noise of the party continued, laughter, clinking glasses. Raymond's baritone telling some story about a construction job in Peoria. Dorothy Finch caught my eye from across the room and smiled, and for a moment I felt the two worlds, that bright, ordinary evening, and whatever this was pulling at me from opposite directions. Robert guided Gerald to a small alcove away from the guests. I followed, leaving the box on the side table under Danny's unblinking lens. "Who told you to deliver this tonight?" Robert asked. Gerald pressed his lips together. He looked at me directly, and his voice dropped to just above a whisper. "Your son," he said. "Michael. He called me 3 days ago. He said if I didn't bring it tonight before 8 o'clock, there would be consequences." The word consequences fell into the quiet of that alcove like a stone into still water. Robert straightened his jacket, pulled a small notepad from his breast pocket, and clicked his pen. His expression was completely calm, which after 40 years of friendship I had learned to recognize as the face he wore when he was at his most dangerous. "Mr. Whitmore," Robert said, "I am an attorney, and I believe you may need one tonight as well." Robert did not raise his voice once during those first 10 minutes with Gerald Whitmore. That was what I noticed most, the absolute stillness of him sitting across from an old man in a catering alcove off the main corridor of Drury Lane, a yellow legal pad balanced on his knee, asking questions the way a surgeon makes incisions, small, deliberate, and precisely placed. Gerald sat with his hands folded on the table, his gray jacket hanging loose off his shoulders. Up close beneath the fluorescent light of the alcove, he looked exhausted in a way that had nothing to do with the hour. "How did Michael contact you?" Robert asked. "Phone," Gerald said. "Wednesday evening, around 6. Had you met Michael Callaway before Wednesday?" Gerald hesitated. "Once. Maybe 8 months ago. He came to my place of work, said he had a logistics job, paid in advance cash. I thought it was straightforward." "What was the job 8 months ago?" "Delivering envelopes. 4 of them. Different addresses around DuPage County. He told me not to use the company van, use my personal vehicle, don't log the trip." Gerald looked down at his hands. I knew it wasn't right. But I needed the money. Robert wrote something on his pad and underlined it twice. I was standing near the doorway, close enough to hear everything, and far enough to keep from interrupting. My chest felt tight, not the cardiac tightness that had put me in Delnor Hospital a month ago, but a different pressure, the kind that comes from standing at the edge of something large and finally understanding its full dimensions. And Wednesday, Robert continued, what exactly did Michael say would happen if you did not deliver tonight? Gerald's jaw worked for a moment before the words came out. He said he had records of the deliveries from 8 months ago. He said if I didn't bring the box, he'd make sure those records ended up somewhere they'd cause me problems. He paused. I'm 70 years old. I've got a daughter in Lyle. I can't afford problems. Robert set his pen down and looked at Gerald directly. Mr. Whitmore, what you have just described to me is extortion. You were coerced. That is not a minor distinction. He let that settle for a moment, then added, if you are willing to make a formal statement tonight to law enforcement, everything you've told me becomes evidence in your favor, not against you. Do you understand that? Gerald looked at me rather than at Robert when he answered. Yes, he said quietly. I understand. I nodded once. I did not trust my voice to stay steady if I used it just then. Raymond Coaster appeared at the alcove entrance, his expression carefully neutral. The guests are asking for you, Arthur. They want to do the toast. 5 more minutes, I said. Raymond looked at the box on the side table, still sealed, still sitting under Danny's lens. He said nothing further and withdrew. Robert stood, rolled his pen between his fingers once, then turned to the table. Before we contact anyone, he said, I want to see what's in that box, on camera with witnesses before it leaves this room. He pulled a pair of latex gloves from his jacket pocket, the kind he always carried, a habit from 30 years of handling physical evidence in civil litigation, and snapped them on with a practiced efficiency that under any other circumstances I might have found quietly impressive. Danny moved in close, the camera steady on his shoulder, the red recording light a small constant point in my peripheral vision. Robert broke the outer seal along the top edge with a single clean motion. He folded back the cardboard flaps and lifted out the first layer of packing material. Standard foam sheeting, the kind used for fragile equipment. Beneath it sat what appeared to be a framed photograph wrapped in tissue paper and a small envelope with my name written on the front in handwriting I did not recognize. Weight is still wrong. Robert said more to himself than to any of us. He set the photograph and the envelope aside without opening either of them and pressed both gloved hands along the interior walls of the box. His fingers moved across the bottom, pressing, testing. Then he stopped. He pressed down on one corner of the base, and the opposite corner rose slightly, a fraction of an inch, barely visible but enough. False bottom, he said. He worked his fingers along the seam with the careful patience of a man who had learned long ago that haste destroys evidence. The panel lifted cleanly. Beneath it, pressed flat in a shallow recess, no more than an inch deep, lay a folded bundle of documents secured with a single rubber band. The top page was visible without unfolding anything. It was a loan agreement. The borrower's name was Arthur Calloway. The lender was listed as Meridian Capital Solutions, LLC. The date was 14 months ago. The amount was $420,000. I had never signed any such document in my life. My hand reached out before I had consciously decided to move, and Robert stepped sideways, blocking my reach without touching me. Don't, he said. It was the single sharpest word I had heard him speak all evening. Not yet. Not until this is photographed exactly as it is. Danny crouched, angling the lens directly down into the open box. The room felt very small suddenly. The noise of the party glasses, laughter, someone's story, reaching a punchline, seemed to be coming from a great distance from another life running parallel to this one. Robert straightened, removed one glove, and reached for his phone. His voice was composed and precise when he spoke. I'm calling Detective Leonard Graves, he said. He needs to be here before anyone moves that box. Before I go any further, I need to know you are still with me. If you have made it this far, drop the number 9 in the comments right now. Just the number. That is all I need to know. You are here because what is about to happen next is something I never saw coming, and I do not want you to miss a single second of it. A gentle reminder, This story contains some elements shaped for storytelling and educational purposes. Details that may not reflect every exact moment as it happened. If that is not something you wish to continue with, this is a good place to step away and find something that suits you better. No hard feelings at all. Detective Leonard Graves arrived at 17 minutes past 8. He was not what I expected from a name like Graves, not somber, not slow. He was compact and direct, somewhere in his mid-40s, with close-cropped dark hair, going gray at the temples, and the kind of eyes that moved across a room the way a surveyor's instrument moves across a site measuring cataloging, missing nothing. He wore plain clothes, a dark jacket over a collared shirt, a badge clipped to his belt. Robert met him at the side entrance and walked him to the alcove in under 90 seconds. I watched Graves look at the open box, at Danny's camera, at Gerald sitting with his hands still folded on the table, and I could see him assembling the picture without being told to. "Robert," he said by way of greeting. They clearly knew each other. "Leonard," Robert said. "The box was delivered under coercion, false bottom, forged financial instrument. This gentleman witnessed the delivery." He gestured toward Gerald. "My client has not touched the documents. The entire sequence is on video." Graves crouched beside the box and studied the open false bottom without touching anything. "Meridian Capital Solutions," he said, reading the visible letterhead. "I know that name." He stood and looked at me. "Mr. Calloway." "That's me," I said. "I've never signed anything with that company. I've never heard of them before tonight." Graves nodded slowly, the way experienced men nod, when a piece of information fits a pattern they've been watching for some time. He was about to speak again when his radio crackled. The dispatcher's voice was clipped in efficient units responding to a 911 call at Drury Lane Event Center, Oak Brook. Caller reported a male subject actively destroying financial documents in a private event room. Caller identified the subject as Arthur Calloway, 60 years old. The temperature in that alcove seemed to drop 10 degrees. Graves looked at his radio, then at me, then at Robert. His expression did not change, but something behind his eyes shifted. "That call just came in 30 seconds ago," he said. "Leonard," Robert said, and his voice had the particular quality of a man placing a very deliberate card on a table. "My client has been standing in this alcove for the past 22 minutes. He has not left this room. There is continuous 4K video documentation of every second of that time. If someone just called 911 claiming otherwise, that call is fabricated." Graves keyed his radio and spoke quietly, redirecting the responding units to the side entrance and asking them to hold before entering the main event space. Then he looked at Danny. "Is that camera still running?" he said. "Since 7:14 this evening," Danny said. "Continuous, no cuts." Graves exhaled once through his nose. "All right," he said. "Don't stop recording." 2 uniformed officers arrived at the side entrance within 4 minutes. Officers Brennan and Coyle, according to their name tags, both from Oak Brook PD. They were young, professional, and visibly uncertain about what they had walked into. A 911 call typically meant a clear scene. This was not a clear scene. "Detective," Officer Brennan said, "dispatch said documents were being destroyed." "Dispatch received a false report," Graves said. He did not raise his voice. "The documents in question are in that box undisturbed and have been on continuous camera since before I arrived. I need both of you to secure this room and ensure nothing in that box is touched until forensics gets here." Brennan looked at the box. He looked at me. He looked at the camera. "Copy that," he said. From the main event space, I could hear the party continuing. Someone had put music on a low, steady undercurrent of a standard, and I could hear Raymond's voice carrying over it, the practiced ease of a man keeping a room together through sheer force of personality. He had noticed the police at the side entrance, I was certain of it, and he was doing what Raymond always did, filling space, buying time, holding the normal world in place by the sheer effort of his presence. I was grateful for him in a way I would not have known how to articulate. Gerald Whitmore had not moved from his chair. He was watching Graves with the expression of a man who has lived long enough to know when a situation has passed beyond the point where he controls any of it, and who has made his peace with that fact. "Mr. Whitmore," Graves said, turning to him, "I'm going to need a formal statement from you tonight. Are you willing to do that?" "Yes," Gerald said. His voice was steadier now than it had been an hour ago. "I've been wanting to tell someone for 8 months." Graves pulled a chair from the corner of the alcove and sat down across from Gerald, his notepad already open. Then he paused and looked back at me. "Mr. Calloway," he said, "whoever made that 911 call knew you were here tonight. They knew the timing. They wanted first responders on scene before you could establish a counter-narrative." He held my gaze for a moment. "That tells me this was coordinated, not impulsive." I thought about Raymond mentioning just before the party an unfamiliar sedan that had been sitting in the far corner of the parking lot since late afternoon, engine off, no one getting out, just sitting there. I had not thought anything of it at the time. "Someone was watching this building," I said. Graves did not answer immediately. He wrote something on his notepad and then said quietly and without looking up, "Yes, I believe they were." The sirens outside had gone quiet, but the silence they left behind felt louder than anything that had come before. By 9 o'clock, the retirement party had become 2 separate events existing in the same building. In the main hall, Raymond Coaster was doing what I had come to understand over 2 decades of friendship was his particular gift, holding a room together through the sheer momentum of his personality. I could hear him from the alcove, his voice rising and falling, with the rhythm of a man telling a long story that everyone in the room wanted to believe. The music was still playing. Someone laughed at something. Glasses were being collected by the catering staff with the soft, efficient sounds of an evening winding toward its close. In the alcove, no one was laughing. Danny had connected his camera to a small laptop he kept in his equipment bag, a habit he explained from years of shooting corporate events where clients wanted immediate playback. The footage ran on the screen in real time, and Detective Graves watched it with the focused attention of a man reviewing testimony he already suspected was going to matter. The recording was clear, unnervingly clear. The 4K sensor had captured the side corridor in a detail that made the grainy parking lot cameras of my office building look like something from another era. Every movement, every hand, every surface was precise and unambiguous. Graves watched the timestamp roll from 7:14 p.m. through to 8:43 p.m. without interruption. He watched Robert open the box. He watched the false bottom lift. He watched the documents revealed. He watched Arthur Calloway stand with both hands at his sides, 6 inches from the table, never once reaching into the box. "Clean," Graves said, and the single word carried a weight of professional satisfaction that I found more reassuring than any longer statement would have been. Robert had spent the intervening time at the far end of the alcove table working through the documents from the false bottom with the systematic patience that I had watched him apply to contracts for 2 decades. He wore fresh gloves. He had not spoken in 11 minutes, which in Robert Vance's vocabulary meant he was thinking very hard about something very specific. When he finally looked up, his expression was not angry. It was worse than angry. It was certain. "Arthur," he said, "come here." I crossed to where he sat. He had laid 2 documents side by side on the table. On the left was the forged loan agreement from the false bottom, the one bearing my name and the Meridian Capital Solutions letterhead. On the right was a photocopy he had pulled from his briefcase, the original deed of trust for Calloway Building Supply, dated 19 years ago, bearing my genuine signature. The difference was visible even to me, and I am not a forensic examiner. My real signature carries a particular leftward lean in the capital A of Arthur, a habit I developed in my 30s that Eleanor used to tease me about, saying it looked like the letter was trying to walk away from the rest of my name. The signature on the Meridian document had no such lean. The capital A was upright, symmetrical, careful. It was a copy of a copy someone had scanned one of my signatures from an older document and reproduced it with enough imprecision to pass casual scrutiny, but not the scrutiny of a man who had processed my paperwork for 22 years. "I have 37 documents in my files with your genuine signature," Robert said. "Every single one of them has that lien. This one does not." He paused. "This is not a professional forgery, Arthur. This is someone who had access to one of your older signatures and thought that was enough." Graves had come to stand behind us. He looked at both documents without touching them. "I'll need those photographed and logged before they leave this room," he said. "Already done," Danny said from the corner without looking up from his laptop. Graves permitted himself the briefest approximation of a smile. I pulled a chair out and sat down. Not because I chose to, but because my legs made the decision without consulting me. I looked at the upright capital A on that forged document and tried to understand what it meant, not legally, not strategically, but in the plain human sense of what it means when someone who shares your blood decides to put your name on a lie. Dorothy Finch appeared at the alcove entrance. She had clearly been watching the side corridor for some time because she had the expression of a woman who has already absorbed the outline of a situation and is now simply waiting to be useful. "The guests are leaving," she said softly. "Raymond told them you had an urgent business matter. No one asked questions." "Thank you, Dorothy," I said. She looked at me for a moment, with the direct, undecorated concern of a person who has known you long enough to skip the preamble. "Are you all right?" I considered the question honestly. "Not entirely," I said, "but I will be." She nodded, as if that were the correct answer, and withdrew to the hallway. Graves straightened and looked at Robert. "The Meridian Capital Solutions name keeps coming up," he said. "We've had 2 other complaints in DuPage County in the last 14 months involving that LLC, both elderly homeowners. Both involved forged loan instruments." The air in the alcove changed. "This isn't just about Arthur," Robert said. It was not a question. "No," Graves said. "I don't think it is." He pulled out his notepad. "One of those earlier complaints mentioned a facilitator, a man named Craig Dunbar operating out of a Bolingbrook address. I did not know that name." I looked at Robert. Robert's expression told me with absolute clarity that he did. The house on Crestwood Lane had never felt as large as it did that night. I had lived in it for 19 years, raised 3 children. Inside its walls, watched Eleanor tend the garden, through every window that faced south. Learned the particular sound the 3rd stair made when someone tried to come down quietly after midnight. I knew every corner of it, the way you know the face of someone you have loved for a long time, not by thinking about it, but by the way your body simply moves through the knowledge without effort. But that night, after Robert pulled his car into the driveway and we carried the weight of the evening through the front door, the house felt like it belonged to a version of my life that was no longer entirely certain. Robert set his briefcase on the kitchen table and filled 2 glasses of water from the tap without asking. He set one in front of me and drank from his own with the quiet efficiency of a man managing his own exhaustion, as carefully as he managed everything else. I sat down. I did not take off my jacket. I was not sure why. "Talk to me," Robert said. "I keep thinking about Eleanor," I said. It came out before I had decided to say it. "She worked 31 years in that school district. We saved carefully. We did everything right." I looked at the glass of water in front of me. "And Michael's name is on a loan agreement for $420,000 under my signature. Sarah's been calling my accounting department. David's been running acquisition inquiries under a shell identity." I stopped. "These are my children, Robert." Robert did not offer comfort, which was one of the reasons I had trusted him for 40 years. He offered honesty instead. "Yes," he said, "they are. I spent 30 years building something so they would have options," I said. "So they would never have to choose between what was right and what was necessary." My voice was steadier than I felt. And they looked at everything I built and saw a target. Robert turned his water glass slowly on the table. "Arthur," he said, "I want to ask you something, and I need you to answer it honestly." "When have I not? Do you want to stop?" The question sat between us like something physical. I understood what he was asking. Not whether I wanted to give up on the legal process. Robert would never ask me that, because Robert did not believe in abandoning things once begun. He was asking whether I wanted to stop fighting the particular battle of being a father to people who had decided I was an obstacle. Whether I wanted to step back, transfer what could be transferred, let the attorneys and the accountants sort the rest, and simply live out whatever years remained without the grinding weight of this. It was not a small question. I thought about the retirement party, the sunflowers Dorothy had brought, the navy jacket Eleanor had chosen from a rack in a Michigan Avenue store 11 years ago, running her hand along the lapel and saying quietly and with complete certainty that I would wear it to something that mattered. I thought about Danny Kowalski setting up his camera at 7:14 in the evening, the red light steady and unblinking. I thought about Gerald Whitmore's hands shaking on that cardboard box, and the shame in his face and the 8 months he had carried that shame alone. "No," I said, "I don't want to stop." Robert nodded once as if he had expected nothing different, but had needed to hear it directly. A soft knock at the front door interrupted whatever he was about to say next. It was Dorothy Finch standing on the porch step, with a covered dish, and the expression of a woman who had decided at some point during the drive home from Drury Lane that the two men in this house were not going to feed themselves properly tonight. She was 68 years old, 5'4", with silver hair cut practically short, and the direct, unhurried manner of someone who has outlived enough difficulties to know which ones require urgency and which ones require casserole. "I saw the lights on," she said simply, and handed me the dish. I stepped back to let her in. She looked around the kitchen, registered the briefcase, the untouched water glasses, the jacket still on, and said nothing about any of it. She set her own coat on the hook by the door, the hook Eleanor had installed, and put the casserole dish in the oven at a temperature she apparently decided on independently. 30 minutes, she said, and sat down at the far end of the table with the comfortable authority of a woman in her own kitchen. Robert cleared his throat. "Dorothy," he said, "did you drive past the Drury Lane parking lot on your way home?" "I did," she said. "The dark blue sedan was gone, but I got the plate number before it left." She slid a folded piece of paper across the table. Robert unfolded it, looked at it, and something in his posture changed in a way I had not seen all evening. Not alarm, something quieter and more resolved than alarm. "I know this plate," he said. He reached for his phone. He did not explain further, and I did not ask him to, because the look on his face told me that whatever he was about to do had been building since the moment Graves had spoken Craig Dunbar's name 4 hours ago. He stepped into the hallway, and I heard his voice begin low, deliberate, and completely controlled before the distance swallowed the words entirely. Dorothy looked at me across the table. "Eat something when it's ready," she said, with the gentle firmness of someone who understands that the body keeps its own counsel regardless of what the mind is occupied with. "Yes," I said, "I will." Outside, the neighborhood was still. The oak tree at the end of the driveway moved slightly in a wind I could not hear through the glass. 19 years of a life. 3 children I had held as infants in this same house in rooms now dark down the hallway. I pressed my hands flat on the table and breathed. Before I reveal what Robert found, and I promise you this stopped me cold when I first understood it, type the word proof in the comments below. It will only take you a second, and it tells me you are still in this room with me, still listening, still here. One thing worth knowing: portions of this story have been crafted with narrative and educational intent. Some details shaped to carry the message more clearly. If you would prefer to step away before we go deeper, this is your moment. But if you stay, what comes next will show you exactly how far this had gone. I woke at 5:40 in the morning to the sound of Robert's car pulling into the driveway. I had not slept well. The third stair had not moved once during the night, which meant the house had been still, which meant the stillness had belonged entirely to me. No footsteps, no voices, nothing but the particular silence of a home that holds its history in every corner and offers no commentary on any of it. I had lain on top of the covers in the clothes I had worn to the party, Eleanor's navy jacket folded carefully over the back of the chair by the window, and stared at the ceiling for most of 4 hours. By the time Robert knocked, I was already in the kitchen with the coffee made. He came in looking the way a man looks when he has not slept, but has spent the intervening hours doing something that made the sleeplessness worthwhile. Alert, in a specific directed way, his briefcase held close, his jacket pressed despite the hour. "Walter got back to me at 7, he said, setting the briefcase on the table and clicking it open. Walter Simmons was a forensic document examiner Robert had retained on 4 separate civil cases over the previous 15 years, a meticulous, deliberate man of 61 who operated out of a one-room office in Wheaton and had, according to Robert, never once issued a preliminary opinion he later had to revise. Robert had emailed him high-resolution photographs of both documents the previous night, along with a written summary of the discrepancy he had identified. Walter's preliminary written opinion ran to 2 pages. Robert set it on the table and turned it to face me. "I am not a man who reads legal and technical documents with ease." That was always Robert's domain, but the language of Walter's opinion was precise enough to follow without a law degree. He had identified 7 specific points of divergence between the signature on the Meridian Capital Solutions loan agreement and Arthur Calloway's genuine signature as represented across the comparison documents. The leftward lean of the capital A was the most visible, but it was not the most significant. The most significant was the pressure gradient. Robert explained it while I read. "When you sign your name, the pen pressure changes at specific points, heavier on the downstrokes, lighter on the curves. It's unconscious. You've been doing it the same way for decades. Walter can map those gradients from high-resolution scans." He tapped the second page of the opinion. "The signature on the Meridian document has uniform pressure throughout. No variation. That's not how human beings sign their names. That's how a digital reproduction of a signature looks when it's been lifted from a scanned document and placed on a new one. Someone scanned my signature from an existing document and transferred it," I said. "Yes. And Walter's preliminary assessment is that the source document was something with a relatively low-resolution original scan. The reproduction artifacts suggest it passed through at least 1 generation of digital copying before being placed on the Meridian agreement." Robert paused. "The loan documents Michael submitted to Callaway Building Supplies accounting department 4 years ago. The ones Brendan flagged. Those were scanned and filed digitally. The coffee in my cup had gone cold without my noticing. Michael had access to those files," I said. "Michael had administrative access to the accounting drive until 18 months ago, when Brendan quietly restricted it after noticing irregular file access logs." Robert closed the opinion carefully and slid it back into a document sleeve. "Brendan did not tell you at the time because he had no direct evidence of intent. He only had access logs. He started keeping the file after that." I thought about Brendan Walsh sitting in that office at 6:45 in the morning 8 weeks ago, holding the manila envelope with both hands, the quiet weight of a man who had been carrying something alone for too long. I had not fully understood in that first meeting how long he had been watching and waiting for the right moment to hand it over. "How much did Brendan know?" I asked. "More than he said in that first meeting," Robert answered without judgment in his voice. "He'll give a full statement to Graves today. I spoke to Leonard this morning as well." He reached into the briefcase and produced a second document, a printed page from what appeared to be a state business registry. Meridian Capital Solutions, LLC, was listed as registered in Illinois 14 months ago. The registered agent was a man named Craig Dunbar, with a listed address on Remington Boulevard in Bolingbrook. "The sedan Dorothy photographed last night," Robert said. "The plate is registered to a leased vehicle. The lease account traces to a business address on Remington Boulevard, Bolingbrook." I looked at the registry page, then at the forensic opinion, then at Robert. "Craig Dunbar was at Drury Lane last night," I said. "Watching," Robert said. "Yes. Why, what does he gain from watching?" Robert sat down across from me and folded his hands on the table, the gesture of a man about to say something he has organized carefully before speaking. 18 months ago," he said, "I represented a retired schoolteacher in Will County, Evelyn Cross, 73 years old. She came to me after signing documents she did not fully understand, transferring a lien interest in her home to a company she had never heard of. The company's name was different then, but the structure was identical to Meridian, a registered LLC, a facilitator operating through elderly targets, instruments designed to look like legitimate loan agreements." He paused. "The facilitator in Evelyn's case was never formally identified. Her case settled out of court before discovery proceeded far enough to name him. I always believed the settlement was orchestrated to prevent exactly that." "Dunbar," I said. "I believe so. I could not prove it then." Robert looked at me steadily. "I can prove it now." Outside, the October morning was bright and cold, the oak tree casting a long shadow across the driveway. Somewhere down the street, a dog was barking at something it found unreasonable. The ordinary world continuing at its ordinary pace, entirely indifferent to what was being assembled at this kitchen table. "Leonard Graves is pulling Dunbar's full business history this morning," Robert said. "And I have a call with Agent Thomas Brecker at FBI Chicago at 10 o'clock. The name landed differently from the others. "FBI," I said. "Wire fraud across state lines," Robert said simply. "The moment Meridian Capital Solutions filed instruments in multiple counties using forged signatures, this became a federal matter." He picked up his coffee cup, found it empty, and stood to refill it. "Leonard can handle the local charges. Brecker handles the network." I watched him pour the coffee and thought about Evelyn Cross, 73 years old, a retired schoolteacher sitting across a table from someone she trusted, signing something she did not understand. I thought about Gerald Whitmore, carrying a box for 8 months of shame. I thought about however many others there were, whose names I did not yet know. "How many people has Dunbar done this to?" I asked. Robert set the coffee pot down and turned to face me. "That," he said, "is exactly what Thomas Brecker is going to find out." Robert took the call from Agent Brecker at the kitchen table on speaker, with a yellow legal pad in front of him, and his pen already uncapped. I sat across from him with a fresh cup of coffee I was not drinking, and listened to the voice of a man I had never met dismantle in 24 minutes of measured federal prose the last remaining possibility that what my children had done was merely a family matter. Thomas Brecker had the voice of someone who had spent a long career delivering difficult information to people who were not ready to receive it, unhurried, precise, carrying neither sympathy nor its absence, only the particular authority of a man who deals exclusively in documented fact. He was, Robert had told me before the call, 48 years old, 15 years, with the FBI's Financial Crimes Unit in Chicago, and the lead investigator on a case that had been building quietly across DuPage, Will, and Cook counties for 11 months. The case had a file number. My name was not in it yet. By the end of the call, it would need to be added not as a subject, but as a victim and a witness. "Mr. Vance," Brecker began, "I'll tell you what I can share within the parameters of an active investigation. Meridian Capital Solutions, LLC, was incorporated 14 months ago as the third iteration of the same operational structure. The two prior entities were dissolved within 6 months, each after generating what we believe to be approximately $1.4 million in fraudulent loan instruments across 11 victims in 3 counties. All victims were over 60. All instruments involved forged or coerced signatures on documents designed to create enforceable debt against residential or commercial property. Robert wrote without looking up. I watched his pen move. The registered agent on Meridian, Brecker continued, is Craig Dunbar, 52, Bolingbrook. Dunbar has prior civil judgments in 2 states for fraudulent misrepresentation in real estate transactions. He has never been criminally charged because his victims, until now, either settled privately or lacked the documentation to proceed to prosecution. A brief pause. Your client's case is different. The physical evidence, the continuous video record, the forensic document opinion, and the coerced courier, that is a package we have not had before. That changes what we can do. How did Michael Calloway connect to Dunbar? Robert asked. The answer came without hesitation, which told me Brecker already knew it precisely. A financial networking event at the Hyatt Regency O'Hare in Rosemont 16 months ago. Michael Calloway attended as a representative of a private equity consulting firm he incorporated in 2022. A firm with no assets, no clients, and no revenue, but a convincing enough digital presence to gain entry to the event. Brecker's tone did not change. Dunbar attended the same event. Our surveillance records placed them in conversation for approximately 40 minutes. 3 weeks later, Michael Calloway made the first of 7 documented electronic transfers to a Meridian Capital Solutions operating account. 7 transfers. I looked at the oak tree through the kitchen window and felt something shift in my chest, not grief this time, but something colder and more clarifying than grief. The slow, irreversible recognition of a thing that has been true for longer than you knew. The children did not build this, I said. Robert looked up from his pad. No, Brecker said. They did not build it. Dunbar built it. Your children provided 2 things he needed: direct access to a verified high-value target and insider knowledge of that target's financial structure and daily patterns. In exchange, Dunbar offered Michael a percentage of whatever instruments could be successfully executed against your assets. Another pause, shorter this time. Michael's gambling debts are substantial, Mr. Vance. Our financial records show outstanding obligations to 3 separate creditors totaling just over $280,000. Sarah has revolving credit card debt approaching $90,000. David's investment accounts have been at 0 for 14 months. Robert set his pen down for the first time since the call began. I thought about the evening Michael had sat across from me in my living room. His hands loose in his lap, his voice carrying that particular ease of someone who has rehearsed a conversation until it sounds unrehearsed, proposing an early transfer of ownership to avoid estate tax liability. I had thought in that moment that he looked tired. I had attributed it to the pressures of his business. I had felt underneath my wariness the reflexive sympathy of a parent who cannot entirely stop reading exhaustion in his child's face as something that still belongs to him to fix. He had been $280,000 in debt, and sitting across from me with the address of a federal fraud facilitator in his phone contacts. Mr. Brecker, I said before Robert could continue, how many people has Dunbar done this to across all 3 entities? A brief silence. Our current confirmed victim count is 19, Brecker said. We believe the actual number is higher. Many victims do not come forward because they are embarrassed or because they have already lost the assets in question and believe there is nothing to be recovered, or because family members were involved and they are protecting them. He stopped. Then, with the same level tone he had maintained throughout, you are not the only father in this file, Mr. Calloway. The kitchen was very quiet. Robert looked at me with an expression I recognized from 40 years of friendship, not pity, not alarm, but the specific look of a man who is giving you space to absorb something at your own pace because he knows that pressing you will not help. I thought about 19 confirmed names. I thought about the ones who had not come forward. I thought about Evelyn Cross, 73 years old, signing documents she did not understand in a room with someone she had trusted, and then settling quietly because the alternative felt worse than the loss. "What do you need from us?" Robert asked. "A formal joint statement from Mr. Calloway and yourself," Brecker said. "Danny Kowalski's complete footage archive. Walter Simmons's certified forensic report when it's ready. Gerald Whitmore's statement. Detective Graves has already been in contact with my office about that." He paused once more. "And I would like to meet with you both in person. Tomorrow morning, if that works. My Chicago office, or I can come to you." "Come to us," Robert said. 9 o'clock, Naperville. "I'll be there," Brecker said, and the call ended with a quiet click that left the kitchen feeling somehow smaller than it had before. Robert capped his pen and looked at his legal pad, 3 full pages of notes in his careful, compressed handwriting. 19 people, I said. "That we know of," Robert said. I stood up and walked to the window. The oak tree's shadow had shortened as the morning advanced, pulling back toward its roots the way shadows do when the sun climbs high enough. 19 names I did not know spread across 3 counties, in houses I had never seen, each one of them carrying something they had not deserved to carry. "Robert," I said without turning from the window, "whatever we build out of this, whatever comes at the end of all of it, I want it to mean something for them, not just for me." Robert did not answer immediately. When he did, his voice was careful in the way it gets when he is already thinking 3 steps ahead. "I know exactly what you mean," he said, "and I've been thinking about how to do it." Detective Graves arrived at 2:15 in the afternoon, with Gerald Whitmore riding in the passenger seat of an unmarked Navy Crown Victoria that had seen considerably better years. I watched them pull into the driveway from the front window. Gerald got out slowly, with the careful movements of a man whose joints have formed opinions about October weather, and stood for a moment looking at the house with an expression I could not immediately read. Not reluctance, something more considered than that. The expression of a man who has made a decision he knows is right, and is taking one last moment to feel the full weight of it before he walks through it. Robert met them at the door. I stayed in the hallway giving the entrance room. Graves had brought a digital recorder and a printed statement form. He set them on the kitchen table with the practiced efficiency of someone who has conducted enough of these sessions to have reduced the setup to a single fluid motion. Gerald sat in the same chair Dorothy had occupied the night before, which struck me for a reason I could not entirely explain as significant. "Mr. Whitmore," Robert said, before Graves could begin, "I want to be clear about something. I represent Mr. Calloway. I am not your attorney. If at any point during this conversation you feel you need independent legal counsel before continuing, you have every right to stop and request that. Do you understand?" "I understand," Gerald said. "I don't need to stop." He folded his hands on the table. The same gesture I had noticed at Drury Lane. The particular stillness of a man who has decided that his hands at least will not betray him, and began. Gerald Whitmore was 70 years old, a retired postal worker from Westmont, who had supplemented his fixed income for the past 4 years with occasional logistics work. Small deliveries, document runs, the kind of cash-in-hand work that exists in the gap between what a pension provides and what a life actually costs. He had a daughter in Lyle named Patricia. He had a neighbor of 11 years named Margaret Osley, 74, a retired librarian, who lived 3 houses down on his street, and who had 18 months ago come to his door on a Tuesday evening with a sheaf of papers she did not understand, and asked him to look at them with her. He stopped at that point in the story. Not for long, but long enough that Graves did not rush him. "Margaret couldn't make sense of the language," Gerald said. She had signed something she thought it was a refinancing agreement, something her financial advisor had recommended. But the numbers didn't look right to her afterward, and she didn't have anyone closer to ask. He looked at his hands. "I'm not a lawyer. I'm not a financial person. but I could see that what she had signed gave a company called, I can't remember the exact name, now it was different from Meridian, gave them a lien position on her home for a debt she hadn't actually incurred. I told her she needed a lawyer. She said she couldn't afford one. She said the advisor had told her it was standard paperwork. The kitchen was very quiet. "What happened to Margaret?" I asked. Gerald looked at me directly. "She lost $22,000 trying to resolve it without going to court. The company, whatever it was called, applied pressure for 8 months and then offered her a settlement that was really just a structured theft. She took it because she was 73 years old and exhausted and alone." He paused. "She told me afterward that the worst part wasn't the money. The worst part was that she felt stupid, that she kept thinking she should have known better." I thought about what Brecker had said on the phone that morning. Many victims do not come forward because they are embarrassed. I thought about 19 confirmed names and the unknown number beyond them, each one sitting with the same quiet shame Margaret Osley had carried. "When Michael called you Wednesday evening," Graves said, returning the conversation to its formal track, "what exactly did he say?" Gerald's account of the call was detailed and consistent with everything he had told Robert at Drury Lane. Michael had identified himself by name. He had referenced the 4 envelope deliveries from 8 months ago, deliveries Gerald now understood, with the benefit of hindsight, had been part of the same network's earlier operational phase. He had told Gerald that records of those deliveries existed and would be provided to law enforcement if Gerald did not bring the box to the Drury Lane event before 8 o'clock. He had specified the venue, the time, and Arthur's name. "Did he tell you what was in the box?" Graves asked. "No," Gerald said. "He said it was a retirement gift. He said it was personal and fragile, and that I should deliver it directly to Mr. Calloway and no one else." "Did he tell you not to mention the call to anyone?" "Yes. He said if I told anyone the delivery records would go to the police the same night." Graves made a note. "Mr. Whitmore, the 4 deliveries you made 8 months ago, do you remember the addresses?" "I wrote them down," Gerald said. He reached into the inside pocket of his gray jacket and produced a folded piece of paper, the kind torn from a spiral notebook. The edges slightly worn, the fold lines suggesting it had been opened and refolded many times. "I kept them. I don't know why, exactly. I knew something wasn't right, and I thought maybe someday it would matter that I had them." He set the paper on the table and smoothed it flat with the palm of his hand. Graves looked at the 4 addresses. Something in his posture changed, a slight straightening, a specific alertness. "Robert," he said quietly, "2 of these addresses are in our existing victim file." Robert leaned forward. I watched him read the addresses over Graves's shoulder, and I watched his jaw tighten once briefly, before his expression returned to its careful neutrality. Gerald was looking at me again. "Mr. Calloway," he said, "I am sorry I didn't say something sooner. I told myself I didn't know enough to say anything useful, but the truth is I was afraid." He held my gaze without flinching. "I was afraid, and I told myself the fear was practical good sense, and I've been telling myself that for 8 months, and I'm tired of it." I did not have a speech prepared for that moment. I was not sure one would have been appropriate. "You're saying something now," I said. "That's what counts." Gerald nodded once, and some of the tightness went out of his shoulders, in a way that looked like something he had been holding for a very long time finally being set down. Graves finished his notes, clicked off the recorder, and slid the statement form across the table for Gerald's signature. Gerald signed it without hesitation, with the clear, unhurried signature of a man who has nothing left to conceal. Graves's phone buzzed on the table. He glanced at the screen, and his expression shifted in the particular way that experienced investigators' expressions shift when something they have been expecting arrives sooner than anticipated. He stood, picked up the recorder and the signed statement, and looked at Robert. "That was Brecker's office," he said. "They've been watching a Bolingbroke address since this morning. Something's moving." Thomas Brecker was exactly what his voice had suggested. Compact, deliberate, and possessed of the particular stillness of a man who has learned that economy of movement is its own form of authority. He arrived at 8:57, driving a plain gray sedan, and shook my hand at the front door with a firm, brief grip before following Robert into the kitchen without needing to be shown the way. He was 48, as Robert had said, with close-cropped brown hair and the kind of unremarkable face that is ideally suited to federal investigative work, the sort of face that people look at and then have difficulty describing afterward. He wore a dark jacket, open collar, no tie. His credentials were already in his hand before the door was fully closed. He sat down, accepted coffee, opened a thin folder on the table, and began without preamble. "The Bolingbrook address," he said, "is a suite of offices on Remington Boulevard registered to 3 separate LLCs, of which Meridian Capital Solutions is one. Our surveillance team confirmed activity yesterday afternoon, 2 vehicles registered to Dunbar's operating accounts, document movement in and out of the building, and a third-party courier pickup at 4:17 p.m. He looked at Robert. "Whatever was in that box last night was not the only thing moving." "What else is moving?" Robert asked. "Money," Brecker said simply. "Electronic transfers from Meridian's primary operating account outbound to 2 separate accounts. We have been watching for 11 months. The transfers started at 3 p.m. yesterday. Approximately 7 hours after the Drury Lane event concluded." He paused to let that sequence register. "Dunbar knows something went wrong last night. He is moving funds before anyone can touch them." I thought about the retirement party continuing in the main hall while Robert was identifying a forged signature in the alcove. 7 hours. By the time we were sitting at this kitchen table drinking cold coffee, the money had already been moving. "Can you stop it?" I asked. "We already have," Brecker said. He pulled a single page from the folder and set it on the table. It was a federal court order dated that morning bearing the signature of a United States District Court judge in the Northern District of Illinois. Emergency asset freeze under Title 18, Section 1345. The order was filed at 6:42 a.m. and served to the primary financial institution at 7:15. He looked at me directly. "As of this morning, Meridian Capital Solutions operating account, its 2 subsidiary accounts, and all accounts registered to Craig Dunbar personally are frozen pending investigation." The page sat on the table between us. I looked at the judge's signature, a brisk, confident hand, and thought about Evelyn Cross and Margaret Osley, and 19 confirmed names and all the unnamed ones beyond them. "There is a Title III wiretap authorization as well," Robert said. It was not entirely a question. "Applied for yesterday evening based on the evidentiary package from Drury Lane," Brecker confirmed. "We expect judicial authorization within the next 2 to 3 hours. The probable cause threshold has been met. The physical evidence, the forensic opinion, Gerald Whitmore's statement, and the surveillance records from 11 months of prior investigation are collectively more than sufficient." He picked up his coffee cup. "Once the order is active, all electronic communications to and from Michael Sarah and David Calloway's registered devices will be monitored." Robert wrote something on his legal pad. I watched his pen move and tried to fully absorb what was being said, that somewhere across DuPage County, in apartments and houses I had not visited in months, my 3 children were about to find themselves at the intersection of a frozen account and a federal wiretap without knowing either was coming. "The freeze is the mechanism," Brecker said, as if he had read the question I had not yet voiced. "Here is why it works." He set his cup down and spoke with the measured clarity of someone who has explained operational logic to civilians before and has learned to do it without condescension. "Michael Calloway carries $280,000 in active debt obligations. His primary creditors are on 30-day payment cycles. 2 of those cycles expire within the next 6 days. The moment Meridian's operating account is frozen, his expected incoming payment stops. His creditors will begin contact within 48 hours. And Sarah and David, Robert said. Sarah's credit card obligations are managed through minimum payments that depend on a monthly transfer from a joint account she shares with Michael. David has been living on a monthly cash transfer from the same Meridian account for the past 8 months under a consulting fee arrangement. Brecker folded his hands on the table. All 3 of them are financially dependent on money that no longer exists as of 7:15 this morning. They do not know that yet, but they will very shortly. And when they find out, Robert said, they will communicate with each other. Extensively, Brecker said, and with Dunbar, and possibly with each other's attorneys if they move quickly enough to retain them. All of those communications will tell us a great deal about what each of them knew and when they knew it. He reached into the folder one more time and produced a business card, which he slid across the table to me. "Mr. Calloway," he said, "there is one more piece that needs to be in place before the afternoon. The financial institution holding Meridian's accounts, Heartland Commercial Bank in Lombard, has an internal compliance officer who has been cooperating with our investigation since last month. Her name is Cynthia Draper. She processed the freeze order this morning, and she is prepared to provide a formal declaration of the account activity records going back 14 months. He paused. "Robert already knows her professionally, but I wanted you to know her name and her role because her records are going to be a significant part of what gets presented in court." Robert looked up from his pad. "Cynthia is thorough," he said. "If she processed it, it is airtight." Cynthia Draper had been, I learned in the next few minutes, a compliance officer at Heartland Commercial Bank for 9 years, a careful, methodical woman of 54 who had flagged Meridian Capital Solutions account activity as anomalous 8 months ago in an internal review and had been working quietly with Brecker's team ever since, documenting every transaction, every transfer, every account-to-account movement with the particular dedication of someone who understands that financial records properly maintained are the most reliable witnesses in any courtroom. Brecker closed his folder, finished his coffee, and stood. "The wiretap order should come through before noon," he said. "When it does, the clock starts. I expect meaningful communications within 24 to 48 hours. He looked at me one last time before picking up his credentials from the table. "Mr. Calloway, I need you to do one thing between now and whenever this resolves." "What's that?" I said. "Nothing," he said. "Do not contact your children. Do not respond to any message from them. Do not give them any indication that anything has changed from your end." He held my gaze. Let the silence do its work. He was out the door and in his gray sedan before I had finished processing the instruction. Robert stood at the window and watched him pull away. Then he turned to me with an expression that in 40 years I had learned to identify as the face he wore when all the pieces were finally where he needed them to be. "Now," he said quietly, "we wait." The wiretap order came through at 11:47 in the morning. Robert received the confirmation from Brecker's office by secure email and read it aloud to me without inflection, the way he reads all legal documents, as if the language itself is the point, and editorial commentary would only diminish it. The authorization had been granted by United States District Judge Carol Whitfield of the Northern District of Illinois, based on a probable cause affidavit, running to 41 pages. 41 pages of evidence that had been assembled in part from an envelope Brendan Walsh had carried to an early morning office meeting 8 weeks ago. I thought about that for a moment. Then I put my phone face down on the kitchen counter as Brecker had instructed, and I left it there. The afternoon passed slowly. That is the only honest way to describe it. Robert worked at the kitchen table with his legal pad and his phone, and the quiet efficiency of a man who always has something productive to do with waiting time. I went out to the garden for an hour, not because I had anything particular to do there, but because Eleanor had always said that the garden was the only place where the difference between what you could control and what you could not was perfectly and honestly visible, and on that afternoon I needed that particular honesty. The oak tree at the end of the driveway cast a long shadow across the grass. The last of the October tomatoes were finished. I had not gotten to them in time, and they had gone soft on the vine, which, under any other circumstances, would have bothered me more than it did. I pulled them off and dropped them in the compost, and stood for a moment, with my hands still looking at the empty vine, thinking about nothing in particular, and everything at once. Dorothy appeared at the fence at 3:30. She had a pair of garden shears in one hand, and the expression of a woman who has decided that the best way to check on a neighbor without making a production of it is to be visibly occupied with her own yard simultaneously. "How are you doing?" she said. "Waiting," I said. She nodded as if that were a complete answer, which perhaps it was. She trimmed something on her side of the fence that probably did not need trimming, and then said without looking up, "Margaret called me this morning." I turned to look at her. "Margaret Osley," Dorothy said. "Gerald's neighbor." She heard through Gerald that something was happening, that someone had finally... She stopped, chose her words. That it wasn't just her, that there were others. She set the shears down on the fence post. She cried on the phone for about 4 minutes. Then she apologized for crying. Then she cried a little more. Dorothy looked at me directly. "I thought you should know that." I did not have words immediately available for that. I nodded, and Dorothy picked up her shears, and we stood in the ordinary afternoon quiet of two neighbors in adjacent gardens, and I thought about Margaret Osley apologizing for crying over the relief of not being alone in something she should never have had to carry. My phone face down on the kitchen counter rang 11 times between 2 p.m. and 9 p.m. I know this because Robert kept a log: 3 calls from Michael, 4 from a number registered to Sarah, 2 from David's cell, and 2 from an unregistered number that Brecker's team later identified as a prepaid device purchased in cash at a Walgreens in Bolingbrook the previous week. I did not answer any of them. Robert answered his own phone once briefly at 6:45. He said very little. "Yes, I understand. Keep me informed," and then returned to the table and wrote 4 lines on his legal pad and underlined the last one twice. He did not share what the call contained, and I did not ask because Brecker had been clear about information management, and Robert understood that better than anyone. At 9:30 I went to bed. I slept better than I had in weeks. I was not sure what that said about me, but I was too tired to examine it. Robert called me at 7:12 the following morning. He had been on the phone with Brecker since 6. "Come down to the kitchen," he said. "I want to go through this with you properly." He was already there when I arrived. His legal pad open, his handwriting, covering 2 full pages in the compressed, careful script that meant he had been writing while listening rather than transcribing after. "The wiretap produced significant material between 3 p.m. yesterday and 11 p.m. he said. "I'm going to tell you what Brecker authorized me to share. Some of this you will find difficult to hear. I want you to let me finish before you respond." I sat down. I folded my hands on the table. I said, "Go ahead." Robert looked at his notes and began. Michael had called Dunbar at 3:22 p.m., less than 4 hours after the freeze order had been served to Heartland Commercial Bank. The call lasted 9 minutes. Michael's voice, according to Brecker's summary, carried the specific quality of a man who has just discovered that the floor he was standing on was not actually attached to anything. He told Dunbar the accounts were frozen. He asked what to do. Dunbar's response was to tell Michael that nothing was frozen on his end, which was Robert. Noted technically false and potentially the most incriminating thing Dunbar had said in 11 months of surveillance, because it demonstrated that Dunbar knew the account structure well enough to lie specifically about it. Sarah had called Michael 4 times between 4 p.m. and 7 p.m. On the third call, her voice had broken. She had said with a directness that Robert read without editorializing that she had not understood what she was agreeing to when she signed the documents Michael had brought to her kitchen table 8 months ago. She said she had thought it was a loan restructuring. She said she had thought it was legal. She said she was scared. I held that for a moment. Then I said, "Keep going." David had called a number registered to Garrett Pullman, the attorney who had filed the guardianship petition, at 5:15 p.m. The call lasted 3 minutes. David asked whether the petition could be accelerated. Pullman's response measured and careful, in the way of a man suddenly aware that a situation has become considerably more complicated than his client initially represented, was that he would need to review the matter and would be in touch. Pullman had called Robert at 6 p.m. Robert permitted himself a small pause at that point in his account. "What did he say?" I asked. "He withdrew the guardianship petition," Robert said. "Effective immediately. He cited a conflict of interest and said he would be filing a formal withdrawal with the court this morning." He looked at me over his legal pad. "Pullman is not a criminal attorney, Arthur. He filed that petition because a client told him the facts warranted it. When the facts changed, he withdrew. That is the correct professional response." "And Dunbar," I said. Robert's expression settled into the particular stillness that meant the next thing he said was the thing the entire conversation had been moving toward. At 10:51 p.m. He falpods. Dunbar made a call from his registered office line to a number in Phoenix, Arizona. The number belongs to a financial transfer service our team has been watching for 7 months as part of a separate but related investigation. Robert set his pen down. He was trying to move what remained. The accounts were already frozen. He was trying to move money that no longer existed for him to move. He paused. Brecker called that the clearest evidence of consciousness of guilt he has seen in this investigation. Outside, the morning was gray, and still the oak tree motionless in the absence of wind. "What happens now?" I said. Robert picked his pen back up, clicked it once, and looked at me with the focused calm of a man who has been waiting 40 years for a morning exactly like this one. "Now," he said, "Leonard Graves and Thomas Brecker drive to Bolingbrook." Robert got the call from Brecker at 9:43 in the morning. He was standing at the kitchen counter when it came through, his third cup of coffee in hand, and I watched him set the cup down with the careful deliberateness of a man who needs both hands free for what he is about to hear. He listened for 40 seconds. He said, "Understood. Thank you, Thomas." He ended the call and turned to face me. "They have Dunbar," he said. The search warrant had been executed at the Remington Boulevard office suite at 8:55 a.m. 45 minutes earlier. A team of 6 federal agents and 2 Oak Brook detectives, Graves among them, had entered the premises with a federal search warrant and a federal arrest warrant for Craig Dunbar on charges of wire fraud conspiracy to commit financial fraud against elderly persons and obstruction of justice. The obstruction charge related specifically to his attempt the previous evening to transfer funds from accounts he knew to be frozen, an act that under federal sentencing guidelines carried its own substantial weight, independent of the fraud charges. Dunbar had been at his desk when they arrived. Brecker had told Robert this detail specifically, and Robert relayed it to me in the same matter-of-fact tone. Dunbar had been at his desk, reviewing documents, and had looked up when the agents entered with the particular expression of a man who has been expecting a knock on the door for a long time and has simply been waiting to learn which morning it would arrive on. He had not resisted. He had not spoken beyond identifying himself. He had asked once for his attorney's phone number from his cell phone before the device was taken and bagged as evidence. I sat with that image for a moment. A 52-year-old man at a desk in a Bolingbrook office suite, looking up at federal agents, and the only thing he asked for was a phone number. 19 confirmed victims, an unknown number beyond that. Evelyn Cross's settlement. Margaret Osley's $22,000. The shame those people had carried alone. And the only thing Craig Dunbar asked for was a phone number. "What about Michael and the others?" I said. Robert sat down across from me. "Brecker's team is contacting them this morning. Not arrests, not yet. Federal charges at this level require a grand jury indictment, which takes weeks. What happens today is that each of them receives formal notification that they are subjects of a federal investigation and that they are required to appear for questioning at the Chicago field office." He paused. "Their attorneys, if they have them, will be notified simultaneously." "Sarah said on that call that she didn't understand what she had signed," I said. "I know," Robert said. "Does that matter legally?" Robert chose his words with the care he always applied to questions that carried more weight than their surface suggested. "It matters to federal prosecutors when they are assessing cooperation and culpability gradations," he said. "Sarah's statement on the wiretap is not exculpatory. She still participated, still signed documents, still made calls to your accounting department. But it is a significant distinction between someone who designed a fraud and someone who was drawn into one by a family member and did not ask the questions she should have asked." He looked at me directly. "Whether that distinction translates to a meaningful difference in outcome will depend partly on how fully she cooperates." I thought about Sarah at 8 years old, sitting at the kitchen table on a Saturday morning with a bowl of cereal and a library book, entirely absorbed, her hair still uncombed from sleep. I thought about the particular way children occupy a space when they feel completely safe in it, the unself-consciousness of it, the absolute trust that the floor will hold. I pressed that memory down and kept my voice steady. "And David," I said. "David called Pullman to accelerate the guardianship petition even after the accounts were frozen," Robert said. "That communication demonstrates active intent at a point when a reasonable person might have paused to reassess. Federal prosecutors will note that." He let that settle. Michael's communications with Dunbar established the longest and deepest connection to the network. The 7 transfers, the access to your accounting files, the Rosemont meeting. His exposure is the most substantial of the 3. Brecker called back at 11:15 to confirm that all 3 of Arthur's children had been formally notified and that their appearances at the Chicago field office had been scheduled for the following morning. He also confirmed that the search of Dunbar's office had produced, among other items, a complete client file on Arthur Calloway dating back 14 months, including correspondence with Michael, that predated the Rosemont networking event by 3 weeks. 3 weeks. Dunbar had identified Arthur before Michael approached him, which meant the Rosemont conversation had not been an opportunistic encounter. It had been a deliberate approach. Dunbar had found Michael first. I told Robert that. He nodded slowly. "That changes Michael's legal position somewhat," he said. "Being recruited by a professional fraud operator is different from initiating contact. It does not remove his culpability, but it contextualizes it." He paused. "It also means Dunbar targeted your family specifically. He researched you, identified your children's vulnerabilities, and used them as instruments. The oak tree outside had lost most of its leaves by now. The branches were clean and bare against the gray October sky, the structure of the thing fully visible, in a way it was not when the leaves were on it. Every fork, every angle, the exact architecture of 40 years of growth. Brendan Walsh called at 2 in the afternoon. His voice carried the particular quality of a man who has been holding a great deal of tension for a very long time and has just felt it begin slowly and carefully to release. "I gave my full statement to Detective Graves this morning," he said. "Everything. The access logs, the copies of the files, all of it." A brief pause. "I should have come to you sooner, Arthur. I'm sorry it took me as long as it did." "You came," I said. That's what mattered. After the call, the house was quiet, in a way that felt different from the quiet of the previous days. Not the quiet of waiting, which is a tense and directional thing. Something more settled than that. The quiet of a process that has been set fully in motion and is now moving under its own weight toward wherever it is going to go. Robert poured 2 glasses of water and set one in front of me, the same gesture he had made the first night, the night we had come back from Drury Lane. He sat down and looked at his legal pad for a long moment. "Arthur," he said, "there is something I need to talk to you about. Not about the investigation, about what comes after it." I looked at him. "You told me 2 days ago that you wanted whatever came at the end of this to mean something for the other victims. Not just for you." He turned his pen slowly between his fingers. "I have been drafting something. It is not complete. But before it can be complete, I need to know whether you are prepared to make a decision about your will." Outside, the bare oak stood against the gray sky with the patient clarity of something that has outlasted every season it has ever been through. "Tell me what you have in mind," I said. Robert opened his briefcase and set a document on the table between us, 12 pages closely typed with his handwritten notes in the margins. The top of the first page carried a title he had chosen with the particular care he applied to everything that was going to last. I read the title. I read it a second time. Then I looked up at Robert, and for the first time in what felt like a very long week, I felt something that was not resolve or grief or anger, or the cold, clarifying certainty of a man who has decided to fight. I felt something that belonged to Eleanor. The document's title read, "The Eleanor Calloway Fund for Elder Justice." I sat with those 7 words for a long time. Robert had chosen them carefully. He told me later he had written and discarded 11 variations before settling on those 7, because every other version either said too much or not enough. Eleanor's name needed to be in it. Not as a memorial, but as a direction. She had spent 31 years in public education because she believed that institutions existed to protect people who could not protect themselves. The fund would do the same thing. The court hearing was held on the 14th of November, 2024, in the Dirksen Federal Building in Chicago before Judge Raymond Aldrich of the Northern District of Illinois, a lean, deliberate man of 67 who read every page placed before him and asked precisely the questions that needed asking, and none that did not. Craig Dunbar entered a guilty plea to 3 counts of federal wire fraud and 1 count of conspiracy. His sentencing was scheduled for February 2025. Federal prosecutors were seeking 7 years. Michael, Sarah, and David each appeared before a federal grand jury in late November. Michael was indicted on 2 counts of wire fraud and 1 count of identity document forgery. Sarah received a deferred prosecution agreement conditioned on full cooperation and restitution. Her wiretap admission that she had not understood the documents she signed, combined with her immediate and complete cooperation with federal investigators, had carried exactly the weight Robert said it might. David was indicted on 1 count of wire fraud conspiracy. Robert presented the revised will to Judge Aldrich as part of the civil restitution proceedings. Under its terms, the entirety of Calloway Building Supply's equity, the Crestwood Lane property, and all liquid assets above a modest personal reserve passed to the Eleanor Calloway Fund for Elder Justice upon Arthur's death, structured as a charitable purpose trust under Illinois law, administered by an independent board, with Robert Vance serving as founding trustee. The children would receive nothing from the estate. Judge Aldrich reviewed the document without comment for 4 minutes. Then he looked up. "Mr. Calloway," he said, "this is your right, and it is clearly and lawfully executed. I want to confirm for the record that you are making this decision freely and with full understanding of its implications." "I am," I said. He signed it. I thought about Margaret Osley apologizing for crying. I thought about Evelyn Cross settling for less than she deserved because she was exhausted and alone. I thought about Gerald Whitmore carrying shame in his jacket pocket for 8 months because he did not know who to hand it to. The fund's first distributions went out in March 2025, drawn from assets seized by federal order from Meridian Capital Solutions, frozen accounts, not from my own estate since I was still very much alive and intended to remain so. Partial restitution payments reached 11 of the 19 confirmed victims, with the remaining 8 cases still under federal calculation. Cynthia Draper, who had flagged Meridian's accounts in an internal review 8 months before anyone else moved, agreed to serve on the fund's advisory board. Dorothy Finch, who had written down a license plate number in a Drury Lane parking lot because something told her it mattered, came to the first board meeting and sat in the front row and did not say a word and did not need to. Brendan Walsh stayed on as operations manager of Callaway Building Supply through the transition period. The company did not close. It kept its 30 trucks and its 25 employees and its 40 years of work, and it passed eventually and properly to people who would use it without using it up. I still walk out to the garden most mornings. The oak tree lost its leaves and grew them back the way oak trees do, indifferent to everything except the season. Eleanor's tomato vines are bare through winter and green again by May, which is exactly what she would have wanted. I did not stop being their father. I am not sure that is something a person can actually do regardless of what a court document says. But I stopped waiting for them to become something they had shown me clearly, and at considerable effort they were not prepared to be. That is a different thing from stopping. It is more like finally setting down a weight you have been carrying in the wrong direction for a very long time. Robert came for dinner on the first Saturday of December. Dorothy brought pie. Raymond Coaster called from wherever he was traveling and talked too long, which was entirely in character. The house on Crestwood Lane was warm and full of the ordinary sounds of an evening that had nothing particular to recommend it, except that it was peaceful, and everyone in it had earned that peace in their own way, and Eleanor's name was on something that would outlast all of us. That felt to me exactly right. If this grandpa story taught me anything, it is this: love without boundaries is not love. It is an open door to people who have learned to walk through it without wiping their feet. I am not a perfect man. I held on too long, forgave too quickly, and mistook silence for peace. Do not be like me. When something feels wrong inside your own family story, trust that feeling before it costs you everything. I believe God puts the right people beside us at exactly the right moment. Robert, Dorothy, Gerald, and even Margaret, whom I never met, but who reminded me why all of this was worth fighting for. That is not coincidence. That is grace. My personal opinion after everything, a person who exploits the elderly stranger or family forfeits the right to call themselves human. Justice delayed is still justice, and love, real love, signs its name clearly and without forgery. If this family story moved you, if you have ever lived a version of this grandpa story, or watched someone you love walk through it, share this, leave a comment below, and consider subscribing, so these grandpa stories find the people who need them most. Thank you for staying until the very end. The stories ahead contain fictional elements crafted purely for reflection and understanding. If that is not for you, no hard feelings, choose what serves you best, and take good care of yourself.